My name is Cathy Williams, and I am currently the president of NDCTM. So some of you know I was really excited when Darcy reached out and asked if this is something we'd be interested in doing, because we were particularly interested in assisting teachers in the rural areas who might not have many colleagues within the district that are teaching exactly what they're teaching, and might have less access to regular professional development, depending, but also a way to bring us all together. I think that's the best of it. And so I am going to share my screen with you here in a second. Let's see. And I do have a bit of a PowerPoint. And hopefully you can all see that. You know, our talk tonight is about high expectations for everyone, and getting all students to the finish line. It kind of builds on a conversation we started back in June for those of you who are with us. But before I get into more of that, I just want to let you know that next month, Harmony Richmond of Valley City State University will be hosting, and she'll be talking about growth mindset in the math classroom. And I think she has some great strategies from Khan Academy that she wants to share with teachers. And so I might say now that sometimes these chats will be very hands-on kinds of things that you'll be able to apply in your classroom on Monday morning. And then sometimes we'll just dig deeply into some big pedagogical questions. And I think that's probably a little more what we're about tonight. So when some of us met in June to chat about equity, we started talking about the students who are often underserved, and we even discussed some ways in which those students are underserved. We looked at a list of 5 equity-based math teaching practices. And these come from Julia Akire and her book, which was entitled Impacting Identity in K-8 Mathematics. And it's something that's being widely read about around the country. And a lot of conversation about equity going on at the national level, in part thanks to the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. Well, we discussed these 5 practices last time in June, and I wanted to kind of come back to the 4th one, which is challenging spaces of marginality. And can everybody see that on their screens so they can take a second to read that? And I think I have a slide that references this quote again later in our talk tonight. But I do want to add that many of the ideas that I'm borrowing here for our chat tonight are a result of having attended some events related to equity. And one of those was a webinar from, that NCTM sponsored a couple of years ago. So I do want to give them credit for some of the quotes and ideas here, kind of process these and think about our response to them, you know, what resonates in each quote. So I have a series of about, well, I think about 8 quotes that we can spend a little bit of time on. And I'll be eager to hear from you about your experience, what's going on in your district. And perhaps even to hear you tell about your experiences as a math student. So the first quote that I chose was from, as you can see at the bottom, The Structure of Tracking. Because this is one of the issues that actually did not come up when we spoke in June and we were talking about issues that impact equity in the classroom. NCTM has sort of recommended that all districts take a look at their tracking policies. And so I thought we should talk about what's going on in North Dakota in terms of tracking, and how we feel about that and where we might go with that. So I will read this first quote. It says, "Sorting students into tracks is a primary means of structuring opportunity," says Anasaya Mayer. "The argument against sorting students by perceived ability is that it results in lowered expectations and inferior instruction for low-achieving students and widens existing gaps in academic achievement." So I guess what I'd like people to do is just share how that resonates with them. Do you agree that sorting students is a means of structuring opportunity so that some students have opportunities that others don't? What do you see in your district?
In our district, they start tracking at a pretty young age. That I know that they offer some gifted services, I think starting in grade 2 in Fargo Public Schools. I'm not real familiar with the elementary structure, but then when they enter middle school in grade 6, that's when they really start splitting them up into what I think is, I don't know if it happens in 6th grade or by 7th grade, but then they have it split into at least 3 tracks. And so, and where I see that at the high school is then there are some freshmen that come in into Algebra 2 as freshmen, and would be like a junior level class on grade level for others. So it gets to be a pretty wide spread of abilities within that Algebra 2 class, and definitely different opportunities for the end goals for each of those students, kind of based on a decision that was probably made in the 5th grade or even sooner. So I get that's what we have going on in our district.
So are you saying that people might be advanced 2 or 3 more years beyond what would be the normal track?
Yeah, correct. And I would say it's definitely more acceleration than enrichment. So they're not like in the middle school, they might be taking high school classes early, but it's not necessarily an enriched curriculum. It's just an acceleration of students.
And you talked about a wide variety of ability there. Are you saying that the younger ones coming in are less able, or?
I guess I guess I wasn't very clear on that. So when I teach a regular Algebra 2, I have anywhere from 9th through 12th graders in there. And so then those kids are coming in at a pretty wide variety of ability levels, that you have these kids that have been heavily accelerated and even been maybe given the title of gifted, and then all the way up to kids that are on grade level or maybe even below if they're retaking the class.
Okay. I was just curious whom you thought did better in the class, those students who had been accelerated perhaps multiple times, or the students who were sort of on grade level?
I think the ones that actually have the best handle on it and seem to have the best study skills and the maturity are actually the ones that are not at the most accelerated, but maybe what I would call 1 year accelerated. So the kids that are taking Algebra 2 as sophomores, I think are really the best prepared. That they seem, someone identified early on that they have an aptitude at math, which is why they got 1 year accelerated. But yet they're just a little bit more mature than the younger kids. And it's possible that they've had some struggles and a little bit, and just seem like they're mature enough to be able to handle that a little bit better than the ones that were 2 years accelerated.
Thanks. And Andy, you said you were in the Dickinson area?
Carrington.
If I got that right, Andy? Carrington. Big difference. Okay.
Piggyback on what Sarah said at the sophomore level, we really only have, we only graduate about 40 students a class, but at 8th grade level is when that's when their math track really takes place. They're either going to go to Algebra 1 as an 8th grader, or they're going to stay with a pre-algebra class as an 8th grader. And those are the 2 tracks. And then the pre-algebra kids as 8th graders can, you know, end at college algebra and stat class if they stay on track. But like Sarah said, the sophomores in Algebra 2, those would be our fast track kids, if you want to call them that. Then they can take pre-calc. And we're actually looking at taking some of the fast trackers and skipping the college algebra course because it's such a repetition of Algebra 2. And we're looking at more of streaming them into a Calc 1 course by the time they're a senior. So we would have 3 tracks for kids, you know, the kids that take Algebra 1 as a 8th grader. They could go pre-calculus route, or they could go Calculus 1 route. And then the kids that are taking pre-algebra as 8th graders, they could still max out at college algebra in the high school level. And that's normally where you're going to see them max out at as a terminal class. And they still get their 3 high school math credits and their honor scholarship, you know, things like that. But basically 2 tracks right now. 8th grade, they're either in Algebra 1 or in pre-algebra. And that decision is made by 7th grade teachers usually, and test scores, and you know, it's worked pretty well. I mean, I've had some kids that have gone through the pre-algebra track, and they do quite well still in college algebra and stat class. But it's a major decision there between 7th and 8th grade to see those kids go one track or the other. But that's about where we're at.
Thank you. So Jody, are you familiar with what goes on in the Grand Forks district?
You know, I was just thinking my perspective is a bit different in first grade. When I read the quote, sorting students into tracks is a primary means of structuring opportunity, I think of the lower achieving kids in my first grade class. We have lots of opportunity in elementary school to provide grouping and interventions. So I see that aspect of it just in my teaching life. We provide lots of opportunities for those kids who aren't grasping those concepts that we're teaching. They still get my main instruction, but they also go to intervention groups, a small group or one-on-one. So I see that side of it. But as I am listening to all of you talk, I'm also, my son is in Grand Forks Public Schools as a 7th grader, and he was sort of put on that track of, like Sarah said, he's 1 year accelerated. And so now that I have a child going through it, I'm seeing that side of it. But as a teacher, when I heard this quote, I initially thought of those lower achieving students and what we are able to provide in Grand Forks Public Schools at that early intervention for kids that are struggling. And I think Grand Forks does a great job of providing those opportunities for those kids that aren't at grade level.
And so is the goal to get them at grade level as soon as possible, I would imagine?
And so they're still receiving my core instruction, and some smaller pull-out opportunities to get them up to grade level. And in Grand Forks, we see the enrichment track, if you will, not till 3rd grade. So as on my professional side, as a teacher, I'm not so familiar with that because we don't have, of course, I'm always in my whole group instruction, I'm enriching those kids that I can see are those high achievers as much as I can in the classroom. But formally, they don't enter into, we have SWEP, school-wide enrichment program. And so they don't enter into that until 3rd grade. And the thought being that they're 2 years of testing data and teacher anecdotal notes to get them to that point. And so that begins in 3rd grade for those kids.
Thank you. Yeah, I think having taught in Grand Forks also, I think then it's similar to what Andy and Sarah are describing in Carrington and Fargo, where they along about 6th, 7th grade, take a test. I know there's a rubric that teachers score to see who is and who's not ready to go on to pre-algebra earlier.
How about you, Sean? Your upper elementary?
Yep, I'm 4th grade. I teach in Fargo Public Schools also,
Okay.
just like Sarah. And
I
similar
didn't
to,
even see it on there.
oh, that's okay. I was gonna chat and say, can you see me? This is my first time on a video chat, so I'm new to this also. But yeah, same as Jody, I have, you know, my small groups in my classroom. We try to, we have a whole group and then small groups, and then I have the kids that struggle a little bit. They leave for their instruction in another classroom. And then I also have, we have GT, which is gifted and talented. And so they will go for enrichment. In 4th grade, if they have to test into, in order to get an ILP, which would be like the gifted. And so they can, I've had a student I taught 5th grade a couple of years ago who actually took 6th grade math when she was a 5th grader. So she was even tracked a little bit higher than the rest of them. And then again, I have a sophomore at Davies High School who he is on, I think, Algebra 2 this year. So he's a track ahead. And it is nice for them, you know, to take those different tracks, you know, in upper school, like middle school and high school. But they get a little taste of that in elementary as well. So our main focus at our school this year is to really do small group math. You know, we've always done small group reading. We're trying more for every teacher to individualize that small group math instruction, having that whole group, but then also dividing into those smaller groups and so get what they need at each group.
So those are leveled groups, you would say?
Yes, yeah, by ability.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah. And where do you teach again?
Kennedy Elementary School in Fargo.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, nice to meet you. I'm sorry I
Thank you.
didn't see your face.
No,
I
that's
think my
okay.
screen only had room for a few. Great to have you.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll share the next slide. And the next slide is not just about what we're teaching, but who is teaching what to whom. And it says the power and status of school mathematics often manifest themselves in decisions about what content gets taught to which students and by which teachers. What gets taught in the mathematics classroom shapes the mathematics identities of both the students and the teachers. And I think this happens at the elementary level as well, but there's sort of a tracking that goes on among teachers. And I wonder if people would be willing to talk about that just a little bit. Like, how do you decide at the place where you work, who teaches what to whom?
I can say in my classroom, I go along with the standards. This year we're focusing on ELOs, which is the essential learning outcomes, which I think almost all the standards that we teach. So we have our curriculum is everyday math, but we also, I mean, my main priority is to touch every standard that those students need to teach or to learn from. I think that's
so
what is
you
that.
teach.
Go ahead, Kathy.
I was going to say, I didn't mean to interrupt, but so you teach all of your students all of the math,
Correct. Yep.
and they all get the same curriculum.
Yes.
Okay. Would that be true for you too, Jody, would you say?
So we look into student data, student achievement, test scores. On our, we have early release Wednesdays where students leave at 1:30 about every other Wednesday. And the teachers get together and look at students and achievement and test scores and common assessments. And that's sort of how we determine who or what the groups will look like. And then from there, in terms of who's going to be teaching those kids, we look at, scheduling, and we try to keep in mind that we have the most sort of the most educated, trained teacher teaching the most struggling students. And so when we are looking into placing groups, we will often have, so I will take sometimes the lower group, and then if I have a group that maybe needs a bit of enrichment, I will pull those activities and have someone else who might be in my classroom for support, offering support, instructional para or something like that, have those people teach those groups.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, that you say that you try to have the most experienced teacher teaching the students with the greatest need. Mm-hmm. And I think, I think elementary is better at that than secondary sometimes. A lot of times at the secondary level, what happens is that if you're the new teacher, then you are assigned courses that some might not care to teach. And so maybe the new teacher gets the low track kids. And then as you work your way up in the hierarchy, eventually you get to teach calculus or pre-calculus or what have you. I don't know. How about you secondary folks? What's it like where you are? Is that a fair description?
I think it's fair. That's normally what you're going to see at a Class B school. Now, one thing, sometimes it's about the timing of the hire at a Class B school. There's only 4 of us on staff that teach math, and sometimes it's the timing of the hire. If I were to resign, would the other teachers look to fill my spot, or would they fill that from out of district or something like that? Many times it's the timing of the hire too, besides, the more experienced teacher getting the higher level courses. But I've seen it both ways that way.
I know. Are you there?
Description. Cathy, I typed that in the chat too, that at least on the AP English side of things, what you described is exactly what I've experienced. And that there, to this quotes point, there's status associated with teaching the AP class, I think. And so if you're the AP teacher, that carries somehow more weight and a little bit more gravitas, so to speak. And that could just have been my perception when I was a younger teacher and wasn't allowed to teach those classes. So then that was something that I wanted, because it seemed like there was that, like that's how you show that you're a quote unquote good teacher, is you graduate to getting to teach the AP classes. So this quote really spoke to me from that standpoint. But I love what Jody said of that, because I agree with her 100%, and I typed the same thing, that the kids who need the best teacher are those struggling kids. Those kids who are the high flyers probably could get by and can figure it out, even if they had a new teacher who wasn't at the top of their game yet. But those struggling learners, they need someone who knows how to support their learning. So I really appreciate Jody's point, and that's how they do it at her school. Good for you.
Yeah, I appreciate what Andy's saying too about the difference between maybe a Class B and a Class A school. Although it's probably true too in a Class A school that if the person leaving calculus retire or teaching calculus retires, it may impact who gets that class. One thing I've appreciated about the Grand Forks schools and the way they assign math classes, at least at Red River where I was, every teacher had a low track class. So I have a colleague who told me when he first started, he had 5 low track classes at the high school level, and he just about didn't make it through the year. And now they're trying to spread that out so that everybody has a little of both, I guess. Sean, did you have thoughts?
Yeah, I would be interested in doing what Jody's doing in Grand Forks, because, you know, we've talked about sharing kids and things like that, looking at data, and my team, the PLC, our PLC time is different because we have different Phy-Ed and music time, so it's hard to get together. It would be great to take like a Wednesday and be able to look at data more, you know, often, and divvying them up that way too. No, I think that's a great idea. I might have to bring that up to school.
Yeah, I always feel like we have so much to learn from the elementary about what they're trying to do with the data and you know, catching kids up. Sometimes it's challenging at the high school level though, because a student might be 8 years behind by the time that student gets to high school, and then it does become a challenge, I admit. Well, let me go on to the next quote. And this has to do with building conceptual understanding. When instruction focuses on building conceptual understanding by using multiple mathematical representations and multiple solution paths, students have a wider range of options for entering a task and building mathematical meaning. I have to say, so even at Bemidji State, I was assigned a remedial class in which students who are not ready for college algebra based on test scores take a class for which they don't get math credit in order to prepare to take college algebra. So I'm teaching that and college algebra, but so I find myself teaching this week about ratio, proportion, and percent, you know, which I haven't taught since I was a 7th grade teacher. I've been thinking about these things, you know, about the kind of tasks they're asked to do, because you're so tempted to say, well, you just do this, you know, you just plug this in here, or you just set up a proportion and you cross multiply. But they have to pass a basic skills test, and they can't get credit for the class until they do. And that includes operations on fractions and operations with ratios and percents and such. And so one question was something like, what would 5/8 be as a decimal or a percent? And so we talked about, you know, long division, 5 divided by 8, and I thought, where am I going with this? You know, this maybe is not such a great idea. And then one young woman, she said, I just can't do that. I didn't get the long division, you know, I still don't get the long division, but she could reason about what 5/8 would be. And so she started some proportional reasoning, thinking about what a quarter was, and then what an eighth was, what a half was, and she could build her way up to 62.5%. So that's what this quote is reminding me of, you know, multiple opportunities, multiple representations and paths. Do you think the students who are in the lower tracks get those opportunities?
When I read this quote, it made me think of right away, we teach everyday math in Grand Forks, like Sean, I believe, in Fargo. And everyday math is so great with teaching mathematical, just different opportunities, teaching kids different problem solving, critical thinking. And we have so many parents, especially as a 1st grade teacher, because I'm sort of introducing them to a lot of these concepts. And So many parents come to us and say, oh my gosh, why can't they just teach, adding to kids the way that I learned? Or, why can't they just tell kids to do it this way? Why do they have to, and it's just trying to teach kids or teach parents as well in my role, that there are so many different opportunities or so many different ways for kids to arrive at answers. And we're trying to teach the mathematical, critical thinking, problem solving strategies, giving kids all sorts of tools for them to try, just in case that way that mom and dad learned doesn't work for them. We are teaching them lots of different, so it's not that we're trying to teach them differently, we're just trying to teach them all sorts of opportunities and ways to get to answers. And I think that's hard for parents to understand. And then when you explain it to them, they're like, oh, I see, I didn't, yeah, my child really does understand how to solve a problem that way, and maybe they didn't in the traditional sense. And so when I read this quote, that really made me think of how great everyday math is at teaching mathematical reasoning, mathematical, different opportunities to get to answers.
So I'm curious then, at the elementary level, when you break into smaller groups, right? And you address the students at the various levels. Would you say with the kids who are least successful that you are still using those same kinds of high-powered strategies? Does everyday math help you do that?
Yes. I think that with those kids, I think that those higher achieving kids, they know, their brains know the way that works best for them. And so they quickly go to that way, they quickly solve problems that way. But for those kids that are sort of underachieving, I find that I am teaching them harder or being more rigorous with my teaching, teaching them a whole bunch of different strategies and opportunities in hopes that one will catch and they'll go, oh yeah, okay, I can use this strategy to solve a problem. I think those higher achieving kids already know what works for them and they just automatically go to that. And those lower achieving kids need me to help get them to that point.
I find too that the higher achievers in my classroom, they have a harder time explaining how they got to their answer because they just know. And so like, you want them to expand, like the everyday math, you have to explain how you got your answer to like adding multi-digit numbers together. Well, they have a harder time explaining because they're like, well, I already know, I just knew that answer. So I do find that the kids that maybe struggle a little bit more or are in the average level, they have an easier time of explaining because they really think and they have to know how they're getting that answer, whereas the higher achievers might have a little bit more difficult time with that.
It's funny that you say that, Sean, because just this week I gave my assessment and everyday math asks to put that mathematical reasoning or communicate that. And I had a kid look at me just like with these wide eyes and say like, oh my gosh, can I just say, can I just say my brain? Like as my strategy, I just put down my brain, I just knew it. And yet this other little kiddo explained it in just the most incredible way. And when that child explained it, it was like, oh my gosh, I can see exactly what your brain did to help you get to that answer. And you're right, that higher achiever was just like, I have no idea, I just knew it. It was cute.
Yeah, I think there's some compression that goes on, when things become easier for students. And so that the process becomes so quick that they're sometimes maybe lose track of what it is they're doing. And sometimes it's just a remembering and a knowing. Do you think that's true, Andy, at the high school level as well, that some of the highest kids can't explain what they're doing?
Oh, absolutely. When I read this quote, right away, I'm thinking functions, and right now we're hitting functions hard in college algebra, and whether you describe that function with a map, a graph, an equation, wording, just many different solution paths. And sometimes kids, they want just the one path. Just show me the way to get to the one path. And I really like to stress, there's more than one path. And because when they get out in the real world, they're gonna see that. But if they feel more comfortable, that comfortable feeling of, hey, he's okay with, I can get the answer this way, or I can get the answer this way. I think that builds the relationship with your student, and they get more comfortable with coming up with multiple solution paths. And that's what I like to push for. And kids are kind of surprised by that because they think there is only one path to the right answer. And agree with the other people here that, sometimes the fast trackers are just so quick with knowing the answer, they don't think about their thinking. But very interesting.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it is interesting. I'm working on functions now too, and it's, I think, partly obviously what they're getting at here is that I think sometimes the temptation is with students who are struggling is to say, just do this, right? I think that's one of my least favorite words in math, just. Just do this, just invert and multiply or whatever it is. But obviously, this crew is not, are not people who are prone to saying things like that. That's wonderful. So this other quote has to do with how surprisingly early tracking can begin. But I'm not sure that's what we're hearing from Jody and Sean, but it says, although tracking is often viewed as a secondary concern, I know that's how I viewed it, the reality is that tracks in mathematics are often established as early as the primary grades when students who struggled in kindergarten are placed in a low, slow math group in first grade. Responses to that?
I'm just kind of impressed with how in our district we really just respond to student need. We really dig into the data and we look at what they need. And I don't know if we necessarily think like, okay, this kiddo was on that low, slow group and that's the path that they're going to be in forever. We just think, okay, this kid, it might just be one specific skill or concept in math. This one has trouble with skip counting, and then boom, right away we respond to that and we sort of do a little intervention, and they're still receiving that instruction. And so it's not that they're on that path. They I feel like we're pretty good at bringing them improving their skills that they're lacking in and responding to what they need in the moment, and then moving on and letting them have that opportunity to have the whole group lessons, and just not necessarily in like a low math group in general, just a low math skill, just to get that skill up, and then we move on.
Sean, what grade level did you say you're teaching?
I teach fourth grade, and I was going to say too, yeah, and everyday math has that flexibility too, where if you have to take a couple days because some of the majority of your students aren't getting that, I try to meet. I taught in a school, Mapleton Elementary. In fourth grade, I had 8 to 12 students. Now I have 20 to 24, but I still try to meet with them one-on-one or even groups of 2 or 3, just so they're small. Because I think, if they are struggling, that one-on-one or small group is so beneficial to them because they get that full-on attention, and you can really see what it is that they're struggling with. And so you can help them that way too. And I think the ones that go out of the classroom, they have learning disabilities. So the other ones, that don't, they are in my classroom and I can help them with that. So, the only reason why they might be leaving my classroom is because they might have a learning disability, like on an IEP, or if they're gifted and talented. Otherwise, I have everybody else in my classroom. And working on that small group or one-on-one if you possibly can, or taking time to, maybe they're not getting the multiplication, taking a couple, 2-3 days to really focus on that. Everyday math is great, but sometimes they don't get enough practice for one skill, especially like in fourth grade. We might teach them multiplying numbers, but there might be 5 problems. Well, some students don't get that concept with only 5 problems. So then I help them so they get more practice on it. But
Nice, thank you.
Yep.
You know, tracking, it comes in new forms these days, and CTM likes to point out. This is actually from Linda Darling Hammond, but, and I know I've seen this at the high school level in particular, where everybody's still taking algebra, but some people have a different length of course. So for example, at Red River and Central, for a time, students all took algebra, but some students took it for 2 years to get through it, right? Or another version of tracking is where, you know, it's called Algebra 2, but it's a different version. You know, it's a watered down version of Algebra 2. And again, the teacher assignment, sometimes students are getting quite different experiences. So I think districts are trying to do better, trying to maybe look a little more like the elementary model where everybody's taking the same classes. I know that's what's happening in Grand Forks right now. Everybody is taking Algebra 1 and taking it out of the same textbook, and then those who need extra support get it during the day. And that's a fairly new process for us. I want to share with you this math biography from one of my students at BSU. Although I have to say, when I was teaching elementary math teachers at UND, I would have the elementary teachers write their own math biographies, and many of them would break your hearts because they had stories like these. This young man said, "My math experience was great up until 7th or 8th grade when I scored 2 points below average on my MCA, which would be a Minnesota assessment. So then my math teacher at the time decided to put me in a lower math class my freshman year. I always felt behind in math. I tried to work hard to get caught up, but I just fell short every time," and so on. And over as I've had students write these math biographies, I read things like, "I was good at math until fractions," or, you know, "I was good at math until we had to do time tests and multiplication," and things like that. But I think one of the saddest stories I would hear is, "I thought I was good at math until we took a test in 6th grade. And they said I wasn't going into the enriched or accelerated class with my friends." Something that happens all the time. And you may have had experiences or known young people who that's happened to as well. But one of the things that Smith, Steele, and Wraith talk about is the idea of a positive math identity. You can imagine what these experiences that I'm describing have done to people's math identity through the years. Here they comment that low-level tasks that rush procedural fluency without first establishing a foundation of understanding can damage their identities as mathematical knowers and doers, and can promote increased math anxiety. And identity is closely related to agency. So where identity is how students perceive themselves as mathematicians, if you will, mathematical agency is a more social behavioral aspect. The current president of CTM describes agency in this way. He says, "Mathematical agency is about participating in mathematics in personally and socially meaningful ways. If one identifies themselves as being good at mathematics, then they present themselves and adopt behaviors and actions of being good at mathematics." So I wonder if any of you have stories to share where you have actually seen an identity played out in agency or lack of agency. You know what I'm saying? How a student perceives himself or herself affects how they actually behave mathematically.
I had a student this year that came to our school. She's from a different town, and she told me right away, she's like, Mrs. Nelson, I'm not good at math. And I said, oh, I said, well, in fourth grade, I'm gonna try to get your confidence up in math, because I don't want you to say that you're not good in math. And she never really said why she felt that way. But I mean, it's like that. She has decided that she's not good at it. And I guess, you know, my goal this year is to try to reverse that and get her confidence back up. But it's pretty sad when it starts that way and already, you know, third, fourth grade. So
I think sometimes you can see that in some of the older grades too. Like when I teach Algebra 2, that's a required course for almost everybody to graduate, but sometimes you'll get a student that's maybe on grade level or maybe a year behind. Like I had a girl that had said that she felt like she wasn't good at math, but she finally got it that year, that like maybe just developmentally it was the right time for her to kind of firm up that understanding. And I had left the course feeling really confident and even was like considering a career like in accounting or something where she'd be working with numbers, and just felt like she now had that confidence to move forward with something like that in her life after just kind of now having some success and feeling like she can be more of a mathematician.
But would you agree that there is really something that happens in this country where kids sort of get sorted at the 6th, 7th grade level and are impacted significantly by those decisions?
I think definitely. I think that they wear the hat of what their label is, and so that they know which group that they've been placed in. And I think that that definitely affects how they perceive their success and what they're able to do in the future. Like it just sort of is a self-fulfilling prophecy for a lot of them. I definitely think that has an impact.
I agree, Sarah. That was earlier in the chat. I asked a question about, do any of the schools represented here, have you seen any schools that wait until 3rd or 4th grade to start pull-out services? And your point, Sarah, exactly was part of my question of, I've read a little bit, I mean, it was in a Malcolm Gladwell book, The Outliers, where he talked about that some countries wait until kids are about 10 to start pull-out services because of that big gap. Like in kindergarten, if you are a kindergartner whose birthday is in September versus if you're a kindergartner whose birthday is not until July or June, your brains are at very different places. And so it's pretty easy for kids to start to get labeled as needing help. But maybe what they just need is a little bit of time to catch up. And I completely agree with you, Sarah, that those labels that kids receive, particularly even on, and it makes me so sad, Sean, I'm so glad that you have this focus of changing that mindset for that child, because it's so sad that a kid would only be 10 years old and they already have that burden and that shield up of, I'm not good at this. Because I think this is the biggest crossover, honestly, between math and English. I can't tell you the number of kids who come to English junior year and say, well, I'm not good at English, I'm not going to like this class. Like, well, give me a shot. Let's see what we can do, because this isn't your regular English class and we're going to do some things and you're better at this than you think you are. And I'm going to use some different tools to try to help you. But because they've struggled and they've been labeled that, they're bad at English. And that's the hat they wear. And they come with that attitude. And unless we really instill them, I'm so glad the next math chat is about growth mindset. That ties into what we're talking about this last quote. Because until we can get kids to really shift to that, those early labels, I do think, really burden kids and really shift their thinking. And why would you want to come to school every day? Why would you want to go to a classroom every day where you just feel stupid?
Mhm. So true. Yeah.
And talking about the growth mindset, we talk a lot about that in our whole building, but that is so true. I mean, we talk about, you might not get this yet, but down the road it will come, but you have to have, you have to put the effort levels into it so that you can get there someday. Some people might get there in a week, some people might get there in 2 years, but yeah, that's definitely so important, especially for those young kids, to get that in their head. I mean, it goes with academics, sports, things like that. I mean, it's all over. So you're how you think you're going to perform, that makes a big difference too.
I know, and I feel charged this semester with changing the math identities of some injured students, who have great plans, have dreams, for college education, but right now don't see themselves as having that kind of mathematical agency. One thing that I want to be clear about as we get to the end here is that people have noted that although there are unjust practices that persist in this country. I mean, you talked, Darcy, about places where they don't pull kids out until they're 10. I don't think there are any other first world countries where they start tracking kids at 6th, 7th grade. Everywhere else in the world, they wait, till high school. And I think one of the most important issues too are the demographic factors. So often these inequities, of different experiences can be tied to race, ethnicity, gender, language, socioeconomic status. I know that I walked into one remedial classroom in Grand Forks at the, I think it was about the 8th grade level. And I almost took a big inhale, when I looked at who was in the room, because it was not a cross section of Grand Forks socioeconomically or racially. And I think that is why NCTM is urging people to re-examine these practices. It certainly sounds like the people on this panel have, very healthy attitudes toward helping students, and but there is a real big social impact to tracking. So it's an important topic. So it's something to think about. How might we, as a mathematics education community, make a difference in the teaching and learning of mathematics that promotes rich, rigorous, and relevant math experiences for all students? And what kinds of actions should we consider? I think the group of you have provided answers to some of those questions tonight, and I really appreciate your classrooms as models of equity.